we are, part 2 of the engine removal. Now we're going to start to take things apart. Electrical connections first. Before you do any of that, you want to disconnect your battery. Before you do any work on a modern motor, just disconnect the battery. Computers don't like shorts. It's a very bad thing. You might not be working on something electrical and your wrench shorts out something, grounds something, and your life's a mess. So just start by disconnecting your battery before you do anything. Now, every one of these connectors is different. They all require a lot of TLC. It's a very tedious task. Tedious being another word for testing your patience. So just take your time. Every one of them could take you a few minutes to figure out. You don't want to pull on wires. You don't want to reef on stuff. Just there's a tab on every one, but they're fused together from the heat and the dirt over the years. So it's a little bit of push the tab, wiggle, move on to the transmission one, which I thought would be a breeze back here. It's a big chunky one. The tab was obvious and everything, and it wasn't moving at all. So I got my pliers out and tried to move it around a little bit. It still wasn't going anywhere. And see how simple it is. It's just a little tab. Push down. It's big and chunky, easy to hold on to. That's probably the biggest connection I took apart. And it just hooks on that little hook right there. And it would not come apart. So what I ended up doing was crawling underneath and disconnecting the connector from the supporting mount from underneath so I wouldn't break that little clip. And once I did that, it came apart right away. So there you go. You never know why, but they are tedious. You want to get all the harness out of the way. It's the most delicate part. Like a little micro fracture in a wire from bending it too much or putting pressure on it. This will annoy you till the end of time if you can't find it. It takes a lot of time to find a broken wire. It might only malfunction when it's vibrating or when it's raining. So you really don't want to abuse the wires. Take lots of pictures. Just go through everything. Here I'm probably popping off a ground wire. I think you see it pop out loose here in a second. Put the stud back. Oh, I think that was a clamp. And I put the studs, bolts back in the block. Anything I can put back in the block, when I take it out, I will do that. Less spare parts laying around. And they're hard to spot. You really got to look for all of the connectors. They're not obvious. I think there ended up being 17 different connections. Oh, that was bolted to the block, a ground. When something's bolted to the frame or the block, it's usually a ground. You want to make sure those are really clean when you put them back together. Here's another one. Looks pretty simple. Push the tab, it came off nice. So the video is playing at 4 times speed, and I chopped out everything that was the waste. It wasn't informative or exciting. Not that you can make a video like this be exciting, but I tried to keep it as undull as possible. There's a little stud. That thing's probably like 4 or 5 mil stud. So what's a stud? What's a bolt? What's a nut? Well, female always be nuts. That simple. Studs, bolts, always be male. So a stud is a bolt with no head on it. A head being a nut that's basically part of a bolt. So you put the stud in, It's got thread on both ends. One part goes into, in this particular situation, is a block. And then you put your wire on it and then screw that down to the stud. So it's a bolt with threads on both ends. And it's a small one. So you don't want to break something like that, especially a small one. It will drive you nuts fixing that. If you can't get it out, I don't even think you get it out because it's so small. You'd have to drill a really tiny hole and a really tiny extractor. I don't know how you'd go about getting out, and you've got no room to work. You'd have to move a bunch of plumbing, piping out of the way, and you'd likely have to drill the stud out completely and rethread the hole and put in a bigger stud and start all over, like an hour or two process. And anytime you're playing with a block and removing material, drilling holes in it, that's not good. So yeah, just be really patient with nuts, bolts, studs on the block, anywhere you can get away with it. Put some penetrating grease oil on there before you get started, even weeks before you get started if possible. Go by there once in a while and spray everything off, let it sink in. This little guy here, which is one wire to the alternator, I imagine it goes to the dummy light on the dashboard to tell you the alternator's working. It annoyed the heck out of me. It's one little connection. It just pushes in and pulls apart. But do you think I could get that little thing to come apart easily? Nope. You'll hear a little click when you get it right, but it still won't come apart. There's dirt fused together from the heat, that sort of thing, and you don't want to damage these wires, so just take your time. I put the bolts back and the nuts back as much as possible. Less spare parts laying around. It's also good to put a tarp down like I have. If you drop a part in the gravel or even on a garage floor, same color as the concrete, it rolls around, but if things fall on the tarp, you get a better chance of finding them. Or if you drop something and you didn't know you drop it, you check your tarp before you roll it up, you'll find it, especially in gravel. It's worth sacrificing a tarp, getting it all dirty. It's also nicer to lay on the tarp than it is in the gravel. Another nice thing about these vehicles is you got a lot of room to work. Like, I haven't jacked this up or anything. There's lots of room underneath. You tilt the cab forward. You're not climbing over fenders. This saves a lot of time when you go into the shop. Your mechanic's not spending all day climbing over fenders or taking shrouds off and parts everywhere. Like in a normal pickup truck or car, there would already be like a couple of dozen parts loose on the ground, over 100 fasteners out, and all hard to get at. And even after all of that stuff's out of the way, it's still hard to get at everything I'm doing. It's just a more efficient vehicle for commercial operators. You'll notice on the big rigs, even the hood tilts forward. So the new pickups, I'm surprised the hoods don't just tilt forward with all the fenders coming off, because I know, like for the Fords, some of them, I'm not sure which years, I know the later model years, you have to just lift the whole cab off to work on the motor. And that might just be to change spark plugs. Yeah, it's just that nuts. There's no room in these new vehicles. So if you get a tilt forward cab over, look at the space I have. Another thing too is why I decided to pull this motor. It's easy to pull the motor, and the rad's full of oil and fluids and all that sort of thing, and the rad's bolted to the motor, so it all comes out as one package. And it's kind of an industrial design where you can put it into anything. You can bolt it up to a generator or a boat or some sort of mill, use it all kinds of different applications. There's probably different variations for different applications, but really easy to put together and take apart. I'd rather have it on a bench to work on it than where it is now, but it wouldn't be too bad to do it where it is now. Also can see that some work's been done to the truck. You can see the shock towers on the right and the left, the shiny bits on top. So the shocks aren't even old, or those little caps would be all rusty by now. You see good tread on the tires. None of the hoses are cracked or anything. Just generally looks like it was reasonably well maintained. I'll check the kingpins and grease everything up front, make sure everything's working. Check the brake calipers later. Right now my priority is to get it running because I need it. My Ford is dying. I don't know how many days or trips it's got left. It's probably on its last tank of fuel, I hope. So I'm hoping I can have this machine up and running by May long weekend, which is the end of the month. It's now May 3rd, 2022, and I've probably got 3 weeks to get this together and switch over my Class C motorhome shell to the flat deck of this ISUZU. Something I could probably do in a day or two, but if I have 3 days, it'll probably just be a little bit better buffer. Notice I just loosened off that really big connection on my hand to give me a little extra slack. That's the main chassis to engine harness connector. I'd rather not disconnect that. There's probably 100 wires connected into that fitting. I'd rather just leave it all sealed and closed together. But I popped it off its mount, so I had more slack to move wires around. So I probably spent close to 4 hours getting that harness loose. I know I chopped a lot of it out, but it was really testing my patience. That little single wire one I talked about earlier was at least half an hour. And the harness is all wrapped around the plumbing, so you want to remember how that went in there, and you don't want to reef-on anything. Don't get impatient. Just take your time and weasel it out of there. And this is probably my last connection. Sensor. Something to tell you about airflow, I suppose. I don't know what any of these things do. I just know they're connected and need to be disconnected. I'm not a mechanic. But I can save myself a lot of money by doing some of the dummy work. It's actually how I earned a living, doing the dummy work. No, I'm disconnecting the starter now. That's another one of those stud bolt hybrids. So it's a bolt, but it's a stud. So it goes into the block, holds the transmission to the block, and then there's a stud sticking out of that bolt to put your ground wire and your starter wires to. So it's a stud basically with the head of a nut halfway up in the shaft. You don't want to break one of those. It's not something you can go into the dealer and order. You probably could order one, but it's something you'd have to go and find one in the junkyard, make it work. Or if you're a welder, you'd make one. It's best not to break stuff like that. Makes life much easier. Here we go, labeling everything. I left the starter connected. I'm not sure if it goes with the motor or stays with the bell housing, so it just left the starter on there for now. And that's it for this part.